All right. Political history of Latin America in chapter 6, now the second half. One of the first questions asks about Rafael Correa in Ecuador. He was the 8th president in a 10-year span, so there was a lot of instability right before him. But he provided some stability for 10 years. There were 20 constitutions in the history of Ecuador since independence up until his time. I did have a student that was more familiar with Ecuador who was telling me that when you put it, like when you describe it as saying that there's been 20 constitutions, that it makes it seem like there's a lot of instability. He says that that many of these constitutions are, basically like the Constitution being amended, but they don't have like an amendment system. And so then that's why it ends up being called a whole new Constitution. So that's interesting. I am not very familiar with that. So he was president for 10 years from 2007 to 2017. One of the things he's known for is for protecting the environment. He sued the oil company Chevron, and he gave rights to nature in the Constitution in 2008. First place in the world to do that. Now, 10 years later, in 2018, he was charged with corruption. There was a court that sentenced him to 8 years in prison, but he was in exile. He's still in exile. He's in Belgium. And so, yeah, I'm not very familiar with the details of this or have any opinion on whether he deserved, to be charged and sentenced with corruption or not. I don't know. Clausen introduces us to the Tupac Amaru revolutionary movement. And many of you were very good in your homework to say it was a Marxist leftist guerrilla group. But many of you were missing what country it was from. So yeah, it was this guerrilla group in the 1980s in Peru. And so, yeah, they were, kind of seen as a domestic terrorist group in Peru at the time. Speaking of Tupac Amaru, where does that come from? Tupac Amaru was the last Incan ruler, 1571 to 1572, in Vilcabamba, that place you learned about, where the people of Tehuantinsuyo continued to resist Spanish colonization for 40 years. And so they were not defeated in one single battle, as is often alluded to. And there's been a few famous Tupac Amarus. Tupac Amaru, the last Incan ruler, 1570s. Then there's Tupac Amaru II, 100 years later, 1780s. He led a rebellion for indigenous rights. He was a great grandson of Tupac Amaru I. And then some of you might be familiar with this other famous Tupac, Tupac Shakur. All right, next we get to Allende. What country is Allende associated with? The country of Chile. In 1973, Chile had their own 9/11. So the US's 9/11 was not the first in the Americas. On 9/11, 1973, the US supported the coup to remove Allende, a democratically elected president, to get removed from the position in Chile and put Pinochet, a dictator, in power. And so this is another example of Latin American countries having dictators in charge, not in spite of the United States, but with the support of the United States. A little bit more about the Cold War in South America. There was this thing called Operation Condor, which was an anti-communist plan by countries in the southern cone of South America. Countries south of Peru and Brazil. There were at least 60,000 people killed and disappeared. Operation Condor was basically the ways in which South American countries helped the United States fight the Cold War. But it wasn't just them choosing to help the US. The US played a role in a lot of the terrible things that those Latin American countries did to themselves. The United States had a US Army training program called the School of the Americas. The School of the Americas started in Panama by the United States in Panama in 1946, and it was there until 1984. The School of the Americas is where the United States trained the military officers of Latin American countries on how to fight communism. So these terrible things that they did in Latin America, they did with the training of the United States. What did they do? Well, they killed their own people. They would kidnap people and disappear them. They would target union organizers, community organizers, editors editors of newspapers and journalists who would write articles in the press that were not supportive of the government or of the dictators. Yeah, people were tortured, their bodies disappeared. Now, these right-wing governments in Latin America that participated in these activities identified themselves as good Christians. So, an example of the terrible things they did, when women would be kidnapped and they would be tortured, sometimes the women would be pregnant, sometimes they were impregnated, raped and impregnated as part of their torture. But these soldiers and the officers that were giving them orders identified as good Christians. So that meant they were against abortion or the killing of the babies that they were pregnant with. So they would let the women live until they had the baby. Then they would get rid of the mother. In Argentina, there was an example of they would have these people they tortured on an airplane. They would fly out into the Atlantic Ocean and then just kick them out of the plane while it was flying in the air. The babies were given to orphanages run by churches, to military officers and politicians who wanted babies. And there's a whole generation of people who were born in the 1970s, who only in the last 10 years have learned that they were adopted and that the people who raised them were not their biological parents. And so, this may sound like it happened a long time ago and this could never happen again. But unfortunately, there's people my age that are just learning they were adopted. And so there's people alive who were certainly affected by this, who, there's just, and hopefully we can learn from the past so we don't repeat it, but historians tend to see history being repeated over and over again. In 1984, the School of the Americas was moved to the United States, to the US state of Georgia, where it still is today. At around the turn of the century, the School of the Americas had a bad reputation for all the things they had done. And so they renamed it, they rebranded to the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation, WHINSEC. And it's still there today, and it still trains Latin American officers on, not specifically on how to fight communists or Marxists. Now the focus is on drug cartels and drug cartels and kind of like rebel groups, militias and such. So again, all these countries, Bolivia, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, and Paraguay, all participated in Operation, in Plan Condor, Operation Condor in English. Then in the homework, we're introduced to Isabel Peron of Argentina, who was vice president, 1973 to 1974. The president, who was her husband, died, so then she became president, 74 to 76. She was the first female president in the Americas, but she was not elected. And I just wanted to bring your attention to the way Clausen describes it. He makes it seem like she became president because she was the wife of the president. But she became president because she was the vice president. And vice president might arguably could be some of the best experience you can have before becoming president. So saying she's completely unqualified just because she was married to Peron, I think does a really great disservice. I think it's more of a reflection of the sexism of his time, than, I don't know, than strictly unbiased account. Then you're asked about Christina Fernandez de Kirchner, who becomes the second woman president of Argentina, the first one to be elected directly to the presidency in 2007. Like I mentioned before, Argentina becomes the first country in Latin America to legalize same-sex marriage in 2010. And then more recently, she became vice president 2019 and 2023. For Uruguay, you're asked to identify 3 prevalent political parties. There's the 2 historical parties. The Colorado party is the liberal one. The nationalist or Blancos is the conservative one. And then more recently, there's a broad front or Frente Amplio. That's a leftist coalition of parties that succeeded in winning the presidency in 2004. Okay. One of the last questions asks, are there places in the Americas that are still controlled by major world powers? You know, basically, are there still colonies today? And the answer is yes, definitely there are. The US, bless you, the US has the island of Puerto Rico, has the US Virgin Islands. Individually, the US Virgin Islands are St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix. The United Kingdom has what they call the British West Indies, that are the islands of Anguilla, Bermuda, the Cayman Islands, Turks and Caicos, Montserrat, and the British Virgin Islands. Those are all in the Caribbean. Off the coast of Argentina, the United Kingdom also has the Falkland Islands, which Argentina calls Las Malvinas. And then in the 1980s, the United Kingdom and Argentina went to war over the Falkland Islands, and the United Kingdom won that war, and so hence it is part of the United Kingdom today, and they're referred to by that English name of the Falkland Islands. France has French Guiana and the French West Indies, which are the individual islands of Guadeloupe, Martinique, and Saint Martin. The Netherlands has what they refer to as the Caribbean Netherlands, and that includes the islands of Aruba, Curaçao, San Martin, Bonaire, Saba, and Saint Eustatius. So there are many places in the Americas that are still controlled by major world powers, and the US is one of them. At the beginning of the semester, I showed you a video of the United Kingdom and how it's more complicated than people assume. And so similarly, I'll talk about the United States and US territories that are more complicated than even most US citizens are aware of. And so I have this 5-minute video that talks about Washington, D.C., the Native American reservations, and then all these islands. There's Puerto Rico, that is where people in Puerto Rico are US citizens, but Puerto Rico is not a US state. It's not a US territory, even though it's part of the US. And so they don't have the eligibility to become a US state because they're not recognized as a territory. And so this island that isn't recognized as being eligible to become a US state has a larger population than 21 US states. They do have a member in the House of Representatives, but that member can't vote. And they do vote for their local, representatives, but they cannot vote for US president. The US also has Guam, which we also got at the same time as Puerto Rico as part of the Spanish-American War. Bless you. We also have the Mariana Islands, the US Virgin Islands that I mentioned earlier. In the Pacific Ocean, Guam and the Mariana Islands are in the Pacific Ocean, as is American Samoa. American Samoa is interesting in that the people of American Samoa are US nationals, but not US citizens. And so they have a unique situation there. The US also has these other islands. Well, we have a different agreement with these other islands. Palau, the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia. These are recognized as independent places that have a special association with the US, a compact of free association. Basically, we promise to protect them militarily. In exchange, we get to have military bases on their islands.
It was just 13 to start with, but as time marched on, the border marched west, bringing us to today and the 40 contiguous states plus Alaska and Hawaii, usually drawn in these little boxes, not to scale because Hawaii is in the middle of a vast ocean of deadly nothingness and Alaska is monstrous. Unlike other unions where members can leave if they so choose, statehood is eternal, even for you, Texas. Now, how the federal government works is a story for another time, but at the moment, all you need know is that Congress, where national laws are written, is made of representatives sent from the states. Now, there are some non-state gaps not visible on this map. The first is Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, which is a stateless limbo land between Maryland and Virginia. As D.C. is a city without a state, it puts her under the control of Congress, meaning that all the other states get the final say on how D.C. is run, while she doesn't get a vote. Anything. It didn't matter when this District of Columbia was basically uninhabited, but since more people live in DC now than do in a couple of states, it's an uncomfortable arrangement. The other gaps on this map are the American Indian reservations, which are numerous. The United States kind of administers them while sort of treating them as foreign nations, which means you could draw the state boundaries to look like this, because the reservations are kind of apart from those states. But the American Indian reservations are such a full of asterisks, oh so sensitive situation, it's also better as a story for another time. Gaps aside, the continent and Hawaii is mostly straightforward, but there's more than just these United States. When the US ran out of lands to manifest destiny, she learned from the best and territorified a whole bunch of islands. First up, Puerto Rico, an organized, unincorporated territory of the US. This means she's self-governing to some extent, and that all of the US Constitution doesn't automatically apply on the island. Now, 3.7 million people live in Puerto Rico, which is 91% of the people living on US territorial islands, and more people than live in 21 of the states. And the US treats Puerto Rico as a state in almost all but name, which possibly soon she will be anyway, bringing the number of stars to a nice even 51. But Puerto Rico isn't the only organized unincorporated territory. There's also Guam, which was acquired in the Spanish-American War, along with Puerto Rico. There's the Northern Mariana Islands, taken from Japan during World War II, and the U.S. Virgin Islands taken from nobody. Denmark sold her. The people in these territories are American citizens. In most ways, the territories aren't just like D.C. Congress can override their local governments, and they don't have representation because no state-tation. But otherwise, it's America. Actually, the territories in DC do get to elect congressional representatives who attend all of the meetings, but just can't vote in any of them, which is either the worst job in the world or the best job in the world, depending on the kind of person who gets it. Also, since votes for president are based on state population, citizens in the territories can't vote, which, as mentioned in a previous video, leads to the weird situation that Americans who live in foreign countries can vote for president in the state where they last lived, while Americans who live in America, just in a territory, cannot. Along with these unincorporated organized territories, there are also unincorporated unorganized territories. Actually, quite a few. They are Howland Island, Navissa Island, Wake Island, Jarvis Island, Just Atoll, Kingman Reef, Midway Reef, Serranillo Bank, and Bottom Nuevo Bank. Most of these were acquired under the delightfully named Guano Islands Act, when the U.S. decided she wanted a bunch of islands filled with bird food. No, really, the U.S. just straight up wrote a law to declare that those islands were now hers. Unorganized in this system means there's no local government on these islands because no one lives in these places. Some of them are barely above the waterline. Now, the weird category is unorganized incorporated territories, of which there is one, the Palmyra Atoll, claimed by the U.S. after the totally peaceful annexation of Hawaii. They're currently an uninhabited nature reserve, but incorporated means the US Constitution applies here to who? The Palau Atoll is like that question about a tree falling in the forest. If there are no people for the Constitution to apply to, does the Constitution still apply? Yes. This means if a foreigner gives birth on this uninhabited strip and doesn't die from the nature, their child would be an American citizen. Now, this category is empty. It's where territories go before they become states, when basically the Constitution fully applies, and it was last occupied by Hawaii. We've gone full circle, but there is one territory we left out: American Samoa, home to 55,000 people. Uniquely, American Samoans don't get to be citizens, but instead are American nationals. They can live in the states, but can't vote in presidential elections unless they go through the immigration process like foreigner, even though in all other ways they're indistinguishable from citizens. This is unique to American Samoa, and there seems to be no reason for it other than that Congress hasn't gotten around to updating the system. American Samoa is in the no government category, like it's Lord of the Flies over there, which it obviously isn't. So American Samoa, with its organized government, needs to go over here, and Puerto Rico, essentially a state, needs to go over here, and the Tupac Amaru Atoll needs to go over here. But don't hold your breath for the paperwork to make its way through Congress anytime soon. So that's all the territory of the United States, but there is one final thing to talk about: three tiny nations: Palau, the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia. These are separate countries with UN seats and everything, but they have a, quote, compact of free association with the United States. The deal is that the US provides economic support and military defense to the compact nations in return for being allowed to build military bases there. Also, compact citizens can live and work in the United States and vice versa. Americans wanting to live abroad, you have three easy options. So that's America: 50 states, many reservations, one district, lots of island territories, some even with people, and three tiny associated countries.
Okay, this video I'm not gonna play because it's a little too long, but some of the important information that relates to this: Puerto Rico, like I mentioned, larger population than 21 US states, has a member of Congress, but that member of Congress can't vote. We have Guam, 27% of Guam is US military bases, and they have a lot of people who volunteer to serve in the US military. 1/8 of their population is US veterans, yet they cannot vote for their commander-in-chief or the president. Interesting too, they have a pretend vote when there's US elections for president, and their pretend voter turnout is actually higher than our real voter turnout in the US, or mainland US. Then again, American Samoa, not US citizens, they're nationals. Another place that's a top army recruiter. The insular cases are the cases that made it part of the United States, similar to the insular cases are also what we used for Puerto Rico. They can vote in primaries, but they cannot vote in the presidential election. All right, I will play the shorter video. It's just 2 minutes, but I'll warn you, it uses some foul language. It brings up Puerto Rico's debt of 70 billion and the restructuring of that debt and the austerity measures. That is something that we're going to talk about more in the chapter where we learn about economics in Latin America. And again, the insular cases are what basically how the United States made all these places officially part of the United States. So the Philippines, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, and so forth. So that's what this comic is trying to bring up. All right.
American.
I don't know how many of you are familiar with these honest government ads, but they're They're comical, they're funny, they're brief. But they also use a little bit of foul language, so.
Territory, the Caribbean island famous for its tropical beaches, historic icons, breathtaking scenery, but mostly for. Fortunately, however, few know about the real Puerto Rico, a territory of the United States since 1898 when it was seized from the Spanish, who in turn stole it from the Taínos, which makes Puerto Ricans U.S. citizens, well, second-class citizens, because despite fighting in every one of our wars, they still can't vote for president and have no representation in Congress. In other words, U.S. citizens who have fuck all say in the laws the U.S. government makes for them. And to bring you the ultimate colonial experience, we've made a few over the years, like the gag law, which banned their flag and brutally suppressed independence movements, bombing the crap out of Vieques for 60 years, conducting birth control experiments on Puerto Rican women, and of course, the Jones Act, which enforced a U.S. corporate monopoly that crippled local industry and, along with other crap, created shit tons of debt which Wall Street vulture funds bought off like blood-sucking chupacabras. And when Puerto Ricans could no longer pay back that debt, we made a new law. No, not to ease poverty and unemployment, but to impose austerity measures, cutting pensions and the minimum wage, cutting university funding, closing down schools and hospitals. Today, many Puerto Ricans are fleeing the island from this unholy shit show we created, which of course gives rich gringos the chance to move in and buy out tropical beaches at a discount. Don't miss our special neo-colonial tax holiday package, and you too can be a pirate of the Caribbean, sipping pina colada with chupacabras, while Puerto Ricans get kicked out of their homes. Visit Puerto Rico, the island you never even knew we were colonizing the shit out of. Authorized by the Department for the War and Territories, also responsible for bullshitting American Samoa, Virgin Islands, Northern Mariana, and Guam.
All right, and last place I'll talk about is Hawaii. Hawaii is not part of Latin America, but you know, the places like the Philippines and Hawaii, you know, get kind of excluded, fall through the cracks of a lot of histories, whether we're talking about US history or Asian history. And so I think they're relevant and helpful to learn about. Some of the key things brought up in this video, they're the first people from the US to go there were missionaries in the 1700s. In the 1800s, they started sugar businesses, the Dole family and company. Then there were militias of white Hawaiians. There was a Queen Lily O'Kalani that they got rid of. And while the United States was making its way back and forth to the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, that is when the United States officially annexed Hawaii. When Hawaii was attacked at Pearl Harbor and getting the US into World War I, Hawaii was not a US state at the time. It was a US territory. It didn't become a state until 1959. And to this day, there is resistance for the preservation of language and culture of Hawaiian people.
The Kingdom of Hawaii remained a fairly remote, disconnected country for many years, until these guys arrived. During the 17 and 1800s, many people from Europe and the United States came to visit Hawaii, mainly on expeditions of exploring the ocean. But the ones that stayed were mainly Americans, who arrived to these islands wanting to talk about Jesus. For the most part, the Kingdom of Hawaii welcomed these visitors. One British explorer even gifted the Hawaiian king a British flag, and Hawaii eventually adopted the British flag into their own flag. There was general friendship and good relations here. The American missionaries who had settled on the island eventually had kids and grandkids. And soon these missionaries and their descendants weren't just interested in talking about Jesus. They were also interested in building businesses, mainly focused on sugar.
By far the most valuable single product Hawaii can offer for that trade. Sugar.
With this increased economic interest, these Americans who had originally come to be missionaries were now much more into sugar. And they did what people of European descent have been doing for many centuries, looking at a culture and government that is different than theirs and saying, we think we could do this better. Let us take it from here. And so during the 1800s, these Americans slowly chipped away at the Hawaiian government structure. They were still newcomers in this ancient island nation. They didn't have much power, but that changed quickly.
Pacific always comes pulling in.
By the end of the 1800s, these Jesus sugar Americans had amassed a huge amount of Hawaii's wealth. And those original missionaries who had come to the island to convert people to their religion years earlier now had grandkids that looked like this. A full-on armed militia of white Hawaiian citizens, descendants of the missionaries, who were eager to get the government out of the way so that they could run the country themselves, help make it more favorable for their sugar business. Now remember, these guys were born in Hawaii. They consider themselves Hawaiians, but even still, their loyalties still lie with the country of their ancestors. They were effectively Americans still. By 1893, this local white militia and their political allies were ready for a full-on takeover of the government, which at the time was headed by this woman, Queen Liliuokalani. The sugar missionaries were still a minority, and a full-on overthrow of the government would have been hard by themselves. But luckily for them, they had help. The American ambassador of Hawaii at the time helped coordinate the arrival of an American military ship and troops to show up on the shores of the island of Oahu into the capital city of Honolulu. Up until this point, the conflict in Hawaii was technically internal, meaning it was between the locals and the white missionaries who were technically locals because they were born there. But the moment the U.S. arrived in Honolulu to provide military backup for a government overthrow, it became a full-on military coup sponsored by a foreign power, a cardinal sin in international relations. But even still, the government backed the overthrow. The Queen was forced to give up her power, and they put this guy as the leader of the new Republic of Hawaii. His name was Sanford Dole. His family was huge in the sugar business.
There's a new taste in pineapple.
And now he was the leader of the country of Hawaii. The locals fought this, but peacefully. They protested. Nearly every adult on the islands signed a petition condemning the takeover. Back in Washington, D.C., a debate began as to what to do with Hawaii now that a bunch of pro-American missionaries turned sugar warriors had grabbed power. Dole himself traveled to D.C. to lobby for the U.S. to take over Hawaii for themselves. But so did a group of local Hawaiians to oppose the American encroachment. The Queen, who was overthrown, wrote a letter demanding to be reinstated as the legitimate leader of the Kingdom of Hawaii. The United States was split on what to do until 1898. The new president surrounded himself with leaders who kind of loved war and American expansion. And this is what sealed the fate of Hawaii. All of these displays of vehement, peaceful protests by the Hawaiian people were trampled on by a superpower who had bigger guns and an insatiable desire for control. So one summer day in 1898, the U.S. showed up, and the flag of the Kingdom of Hawaii was taken down, and the U.S. flag was raised. Hawaii was now officially a possession of the United States of America. With the help of these sugar-loving missionaries, these islands had been plucked from their people and put in the hands of a growing superpower. But stealing land is one thing. The real theft is what happened next. At this point, Hawaii was just a U.S. territory, not a state. But even still, the U.S. began a deep, widespread destruction of Hawaiian way of life. The Hawaiian language was banned in schools, and government and businesses were by law required to be conducted in English. The U.S. began developing land, often on sacred sites, and the history itself was censored to make it seem as if the Hawaiian people welcomed the U.S. without a fight. Much of the real history became inaccessible because it was only documented in the Hawaiian language, which was beginning to die. And then in 1959, Hawaii became the 50th state of the Union and quickly became the place we know today. While Dole Food Company, the company who was perhaps helped the most by this land grab, has become a massive global corporation. By 1993, Hawaii was a full-on part of the United States. That year, President Bill Clinton came out with an apology.
Presidential apology. At the White House yesterday, President Clinton signed a formal letter of apology to the people of Hawaii. He was apologizing on behalf of the U.S. government for the government's involvement 100 years ago in removing the independent Hawaiian monarchy by force.
But despite this horrendous land grab and the pillaging and theft of these islands, there is a little bit of hope here. That spirit of peaceful resistance that led to petitions and protests back in 1893 persisted even after the takeover. The Hawaiian language was delicately preserved through painstaking effort, and today